The silence in courtroom 4B was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and perfectly calibrated. It was the kind of silence that existed only because I allowed it to. I sat on the elevated bench, my back straight, my gaze fixed on the manila folder resting before me. My hands were folded neatly, fingers laced, not a tremor in sight. The wood of the desk was cool and polished, an anchor against the frantic energy radiating from the defense table below. Case number 2026 CR 8842, I said. My voice was steady, projecting just enough to command the room without needing to raise the volume. The state versus Sarah Jenkins. The name felt like a cold stone in my mouth. My own surname, a name that I had kept despite them, a name that they had tried to strip me in the whispers of their country club social circle. Across the room, Sarah sat beside her high-priced, sweat-beading defense attorney. She looked smaller than I remembered. The frantic, manicured elegance she had cultivated for years had begun to fray at the edges. The frantic desperation of someone who realized far too late that money cannot stop a legal avalanche. She didn't look up. She was busy scanning her phone, still treating the courtroom like a waiting room. Then the gallery door creaked. Footsteps echoed, rhythmic, hesitant, terrified. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. I knew the cadence of my father's walk, the specific, labored hitch in his step that appeared whenever he felt he was losing control. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. The gallery stood. My father, Richard, stood in the front row. Beside him was my mother, Martha, her face a mask of practiced, performative concern. My father's eyes scanned the room, looking for a target, looking for a way to intimidate someone, anyone, into making this problem disappear for his golden child. Then his gaze locked onto the bench. He didn't just stop walking, he recoiled. He grabbed the back of the wooden pew to steady himself, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. As he stumbled back, his chair, left empty for a split second, clattered against the marble floor with a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the high ceilings. The sound was singular, absolute. I leaned forward, my face a carefully crafted expression of judicial neutrality. I looked directly at him. I saw the recognition, the slow, agonizing realization dawning in his eyes that the woman sitting in the robes was not the failure he had banished 8 years ago. "Please, be seated," I said, my voice crisp and unforgiving. "Mr. Jenkins, if you cannot remain composed, I will have you removed." Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in her life, the smirk didn't reach her lips. She looked at our father, then back to me, the color draining from her face as the impossible reality anchored itself into her brain. The clock on the wall ticked. 4 seconds. 5. She had no idea what was in the folder. If you're new here, like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 8 years earlier, the air in our family dining room hadn't been sterile and cold like a courtroom. It had been thick with the smell of roasted rosemary and the suffocating perfume of my mother's expectations. I had been sitting at the table, my heart pounding a rhythm of quiet panic against my ribs. I had the official letter from the state bar tucked into the inner pocket of my blazer. I had passed. I had survived the sleepless nights, the library floor naps, and the crushing weight of their constant, subtle belittling. I was ready to tell them. I was ready to finally be someone in their eyes. Sarah had arrived late, as usual. She swept in, dropping her designer bag on the heirloom rug, her face etched with a performative, frantic distress. "I tried," she had said, her voice shaking with a practiced tremor. "I really tried to help her, Mom, but she's not applying herself. I saw the results myself. She failed. Twice." The silence that followed was not the respectful silence of a courtroom. It was the suffocating silence of a grave. My father didn't ask me. He didn't look at me. He looked at Sarah, his face softening with a pity that burned like acid. My mother turned her head away from me, her posture stiffening, as if my proximity were a stain on her reputation. "I passed," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, but it carried no weight in that room. It was like throwing a pebble into a hurricane. "Don't lie, Elena," my mother snapped, her eyes not even meeting mine. "Your sister has been nothing but supportive of your aspirations. Do not insult us by inventing success you haven't earned." "I have the letter," I persisted, reaching for my pocket. "We don't want to see your forgeries," my father said, his voice flat, final, and devoid of the love I had spent 20 years trying to win. He pushed his plate away. "You've embarrassed this family enough with your instability. You need to leave, tonight." I stood there, the letter burning against my chest. They didn't want the truth. The truth didn't fit the narrative they had constructed, the narrative where Sarah was the brilliant, effortless success, and I was the broken, disappointing project that failed to launch. I looked at Sarah. She was pouring herself a glass of wine, her gaze locked on the kitchen cabinets, a tiny, satisfied twitch at the corner of her mouth. She hadn't just lied, she had orchestrated a complete erasure. She knew that by isolating me, she wouldn't just be the only one in the spotlight, she'd be the only one left to inherit the estate, the only one to carry the name. I didn't scream, I didn't beg. I walked out of that house and into a rain-slicked night, clutching a degree that no one believed I had earned. I had no money, no support, and my own parents had just told me I was dead to them. I didn't realize then that the cruelty of that night was the greatest gift they could ever have given me. The years that followed were not a montage of struggle. They were a series of calculated, agonizingly slow steps towards a horizon I couldn't yet see. I moved into a studio apartment that smelled perpetually of mildew and old radiator heat. My first job wasn't at a firm, it was at a call center, where I spent 10 hours a day being yelled at by strangers while my feet ached and my throat went raw. I ate white rice and canned beans, measuring my life in the pennies I needed to save for the next filing fee. Loneliness wasn't a sharp pain anymore, it was a companion. I learned to talk to myself, to debate legal theories in the shower, to memorize statutes while scrubbing floors. I didn't have a family to call, but I had the truth, and for the first time, that was enough to keep me from breaking. When I met David, it was in the back corner of a public law library, where we were both nursing the same lukewarm cup of machine coffee. He was a public defender, exhausted, brilliant, and as broke as I was. He didn't care about my pedigree or my parents' status. He cared that I could find a loophole in a zoning ordinance at 3 in the morning when everyone else had given up. We didn't have a wedding, we had a courthouse marriage with a friend as a witness. When our daughter Maya was born, I didn't call my parents. I didn't send an announcement. I looked at her tiny, perfect face and promised her that she would never have to lie to be loved. I worked 2 jobs while studying for the bar, again, just to be sure. I didn't just want to pass, I wanted to be so undeniably competent that no one could ever again dismiss my reality as a forgery. Small wins became my oxygen. Passing the exam, this time with honors, wasn't a celebration, it was a tactical milestone. Getting my first clerkship was the next. Every night I would come home to the sound of Maya breathing in her crib, kiss David's tired forehead, and then open my books. I didn't seek power for the sake of wealth. I sought it for the sake of armor. I watched the news from a distance, catching glimpses of Sarah in the social columns. She was living the life they had stolen from me, built on a foundation of shifting sand. I knew, with the cold, patient intuition of someone who has spent years in the shadows, sand eventually gives way. I was building a structure of steel. They were just playing with paper. And while they were busy maintaining the facade of the perfect family, I was quietly learning exactly how the law works when you want to take someone's world apart brick by brick. If any part of this feels familiar, leave a comment below. It helps us grow this community.
I didn't just become a lawyer, I became an expert in forensic financial reconstruction. While Sarah was climbing the social ladder, marrying into a family that valued appearances above all else, I was buried in the underbelly of corporate malfeasance. I spent 3 years working as a junior analyst for a federal task force, hunting down money laundering schemes and shell companies. It was tedious, invisible work. I spent my days staring at spreadsheets, tracking the flow of illicit capital through blind trusts and offshore accounts. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a panoramic view of human greed. I learned that people like my sister never actually get smarter, they just get bolder. They assume that if they move money quickly enough or hide it behind enough layers of consulting fees, the truth will remain buried. They were wrong. I started keeping a private file. I didn't need a detective to tell me what Sarah was doing. I saw the patterns in the public record, the sudden, inexplicable investments, the business ventures that folded as quickly as they opened, the lavish lifestyle that lacked a discernible source of income. It was all there, written in the language of bank transfers and notarized signatures. I wasn't looking for revenge, I was looking for patterns. I was looking for the inevitable moment when the sheer volume of her lies would become too heavy for the structure to hold. When I was finally appointed as a judge, it wasn't because of luck or political maneuvering, it was because I was the only candidate who could process a complex financial fraud case in her sleep. I sought for the interviews, I passed the background checks, and I accepted the robe with a sense of quiet, tactical purpose. I knew my family would never recognize me because they had never actually seen me. They had only ever seen the version of me that was convenient for them, the version that was supposed to fail. They had spent 8 years ignoring my existence, which meant they had spent 8 years ignoring my growth. They didn't know I was in the jurisdiction. They didn't know I was the one presiding over the circuit. And then the day came. It wasn't a coincidence that her case landed on my docket. It was a mathematical inevitability. When the system began to collapse around her, she didn't have anywhere else to go. Her lawyers, desperate to keep her out of federal custody, had filed for a venue change, and due to a clerical quirk in our region, her case was assigned to my chambers. I looked at the folder on my desk, the one that contained the evidence that would end her life as she knew it, and I felt nothing. No anger, no glee, no desire for retribution, only the cold, precise satisfaction of a long-term strategy finally reaching its conclusion. I was the architect of this moment, and she had provided every single brick.
The first time she contacted me, I was in my chambers, reviewing a motion to suppress evidence in an unrelated tax evasion case. My phone buzzed, a burner number I kept for private matters. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. Elena, it's Sarah. I know it's been years. I'm in so much trouble. Mom and Dad, they're terrified. They said you're a lawyer now, that you're doing well. I need someone who understands, someone who won't judge me. Please, I don't know who else to call. Her voice was thick with that same feigned vulnerability that had successfully manipulated our parents for nearly 28 years. She was reaching out not because she missed her sister, but because she needed a miracle. She needed a fixer. She assumed that because I was the failure, I would be desperate for her approval, or perhaps desperate enough for money to bury her secrets for her. She had no idea that I was the one who had signed the order authorizing the subpoena of her primary bank account. She had no idea that her legal trouble was in fact an investigation I'd been overseeing for months. I listened to the message, then deleted it. I didn't reply. To acknowledge her was to enter her world, and I was finished playing by her rules. 3 days later, she showed up at the courthouse. She wasn't there for a hearing. She was there to scout the terrain, hoping to find a sympathetic clerk or a overworked public defender she could charm. I watched through the security feed in my office as she paced the lobby. She looked frantic, her movements sharp and jagged. She was looking for an exit strategy, but she was looking in the wrong place. She was looking for a person, but she was already trapped in a process. I called my bailiff into my chambers. When the defendant, Sarah Jenkins, arrives for her arraignment on Friday, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake, ensure the seating is arranged according to standard protocol, no exceptions, and make sure the gallery is prepared for a full house. I want a record of every person who enters that room. Understood, Judge, he replied. He was a man who knew better than to ask why a judge would be so specifically interested in a mid-level fraud case. I sat back in my leather chair, looking out at the city skyline. I thought about the house where I grew up, the cold, pristine silence of a home that never felt like one. I thought about the lies that had been used to build a monument to my sister's vanity. She was coming for help, hoping for mercy. She was going to be disappointed. She didn't want the truth. She wanted an accomplice, and I was about to give her the law. The days leading up to the arraignment were a masterclass in controlled suspense. I continued my work, signing orders and hearing motions, my demeanor unchanged. The courtroom was my sanctuary, a place where reality was determined by evidence, not perception. Sarah, meanwhile, was unraveling. My office received daily filings from her team, frivolous motions, requests for delays, frantic attempts to find any procedural crack to crawl through. Every single filing crossed my desk. I read them all with the detachment of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. Each document was a testament to her desperation and her arrogance. She still believed she could outrun the truth, that she could simply outmaneuver the system as she had outmaneuvered me. On the morning of the arraignment, the air in the courthouse was different. It carried the scent of impending collapse. My parents arrived early. I saw them on the security monitor, huddled in the hallway. My father, Richard, was adjusting his tie, the same precise, obsessive movement he used whenever he needed to project an image of absolute authority. My mother, Martha, was clinging to his arm, her face a mask of brittle resolve. They were there to perform the role of the devoted family, the pillars of the community, standing by their daughter. They had no idea that they were walking into a room where their influence meant nothing. They were operating on the assumption that the justice system, like everything else in their world, was a hierarchy that could be managed. I sat in my chambers, going over the trial brief one last time. My clerk knocked softly. "The gallery is full, Judge. The defendant and her counsel have checked in." "Thank you," I replied. I took a moment to look at my reflection in the glass of the window. I didn't see the girl who had been discarded 8 years ago. I didn't see the daughter who had been told she was a failure. I saw a woman who had built her own foundation, stone by stone, through sheer, uncompromising will. I walked into the courtroom, the heavy oak doors swinging open behind me. The room fell silent. It felt like a held breath. My gaze swept across the room, the rows of onlookers, the defense team, the prosecutor. And then I saw them, my parents. They were sitting in the front row, their eyes fixed on the door, expecting someone else, expecting a judge who could be bought or charmed or intimidated. When I took my seat on the bench, I didn't rush. I adjusted my robes, I picked up my pen, I looked down at the docket. Then I lifted my eyes to the room. The moment of recognition was coming, and for the first time, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I was waiting for the moment they realized that their world had finally run out of lies. The courtroom was an echo chamber of held breaths. I placed my hands on the mahogany desk, the wood grain cool against my skin. "Case number 2026-CR8842, I said. My voice was a calm, precise instrument, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. The state versus Sarah Jenkins. The sound of the chair hitting the floor was the only discord in an otherwise perfectly ordered room. My father had stood up with such violent force that he looked like a man being pulled upward by a hook. His face, usually a mask of rigid composure, was a landscape of raw, unvarnished shock.
Beside him, my mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, darting from my robes to the bailiff, and then back to me, searching for a sign that this was a mistake, a prank, a glitch in her reality. Sarah, however, remained seated. She was staring at me, her mouth slightly parted, her composure disintegrating in real time. She wasn't looking at a judge, she was looking at the ghost she had tried to bury. "Mr. Jenkins," I said, my gaze shifting to my father. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the very reality he had spent years denying. "You are in a court of law. If you cannot maintain order, you will be escorted out. Do I make myself clear?" He didn't speak. He couldn't. His pride, which had been the foundation of his entire life, was curdling in front of a gallery of full witnesses. "Counsel," I turned my attention to Sarah's defense attorney, whose forehead was glistening with sweat. "Please present your client for the reading of the charges." Sarah stood, her movements shaky. She looked toward her parents, a silent plea for them to do something, to say something, to fix this. But they were frozen. I had spent 8 years becoming the master of this room. They had spent 8 years perfecting the art of pretending I didn't exist. Now, they were both equally powerless. I opened the manila folder. I didn't need to check the documents. I knew every single page by heart. "Miss Jenkins," I continued, my voice steady, devoid of the emotional baggage they expected me to carry, "you are charged with multiple counts of financial fraud and embezzlement. You have built a life on a foundation of documented deception. Today, we are going to look at the facts." I began to recite the evidence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every fact was a heavy iron weight. I detailed the shell companies, the falsified tax filings, the systematic siphoning of assets, the very things she thought were invisible because she thought no one was paying enough attention to the failure. As I spoke, the courtroom shifted. The gallery, which had been buzzing with curiosity, went deadly still. Every eye in the room was fixed on the evidence I was presenting, not as a sister, but as the law. I watched Sarah's face as the reality of her exposure hit her. It wasn't the realization that she was going to lose her money or her status. It was the realization that I had been watching, waiting, and building this moment for 8 years. I had won, not with luck, not with passion, but with the cold, hard, unassailable truth. The trial did not end in a cathartic explosion. It ended in the quiet, methodical exhaustion of a system correcting a long-standing error. Sarah was remanded into custody pending a full forensic audit. As the bailiffs moved in to lead her away, she didn't look at me with anger anymore. She looked at me with a hollow, dazed recognition. For the first time, she saw me not as a pawn in her life's narrative, but as a person who had spent nearly a decade becoming the force that would eventually dismantle her. My parents remained in the gallery until the room was nearly empty. When they finally stood, my mother looked as though she had aged a decade in 60 minutes. My father didn't look at me. He looked at his shoes, his posture defeated, the arrangement that once defined him replaced by the crushing weight of public humiliation. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that the failure they had discarded was the only one in the room with the power to offer them mercy, and that I had no intention of doing so. I didn't offer a dramatic parting speech. I didn't tell them I was sorry. I simply gathered my files, tapped my gavel once, a sound that signaled not just the end of a hearing, but the end of a lifetime of subservience, and I retired to my chambers. I walked out of the courthouse that evening into the soft, cooling air of the city. David was waiting for me in the parking lot. Maya was holding his hand. She ran toward me, and as I picked her up, the weight of the last 8 years seemed to lift from my shoulders. I had been told I was nothing. I had been told I was a failure. I had spent years in the shadows, fighting for the right to define my own existence. And in the end, I had learned the most important truth of all. Your worth is not a gift that others grant you. It is a fortress you build yourself. I didn't need my family's approval to be whole. I didn't need their validation to be successful. I only needed to remain true to the facts, to the law, and to the life I had built for myself. I never saw them again. I didn't need to. The story of my life was no longer written by the lies they told about me. It was written by the choices I made, the resilience I forged, and the truth I stood for. And as I walked toward my car, the city lights shimmering in the distance, I knew that for the first time in my life, I was finally, truly free. If this story reminded you that your worth was never determined by someone else's approval, share it with someone who needs to hear it.